Okay, so I'm going to talk about my experiences going to English boarding schools. I lived in England for 8 years as a child. I moved there in 1966 when I was 9 years old. And we lived in the middle of the country. And if you wanted to go to school out in the, outside of London, there weren't that many great choices for local schools. So what a lot of middle and upper income sort of families did was to send their kids to boarding school, and that's what I did. I went away to an English boarding school at the age of 9. My school was south of Oxford, about 20 miles, and it had about 200 kids in it. Most of the kids who were there went there when they were 8 years old. It was all boys. It was run by an ex-military officer, Major Pike, and it had a very strict disciplinary code. We all wore gray uniforms, and the buildings were quite austere. And I remember my first day going to school. Because we arrived in England halfway through the term. I went there at what they call tea time, which is like supper at the end of the day during the middle of the week. And my parents and I were met by the headmaster, who took us down a long, dark hallway. And at the end of the hallway was a door into the dining room. And as we approached, you could hear the roar of the kids in the dining room. And when we opened the door, a hush fell over the room. And my brother and I were led to our respective tables, where we sat down and we watched our parents disappear as they closed the door behind us. And that was the beginning of a really almost traumatic change in my life, in that these schools were academically very, competitive and strong, but socially it was, these boys were not necessarily friendly to foreigners who went to a school where the demographics were all pretty much white, middle class, or upper class kids. And I did get picked on. There was a bully who went after me because I was a Yank, and Yanks weren't very popular because back in the 1960s, the British economy was struggling, and rich Americans were coming over and buying up a lot of land and a lot of furniture and a lot of the things that the English valued. And Americans were resented. And I had to learn how to assimilate very quickly, and which I did. I developed an English accent in probably the space of 3 months. And I learned to play cricket and rugby and soccer, and ended up being on the first 11 cricket team, which was, probably would have been a surprise to my parents. And anyway, I ended up actually enjoying my school days in England. My theory is they spent 95% of all the fees on the academics, and 0.01% on food. The food was terrible. I would have bacon and fried bread for breakfast, and kippers, and very stale bread. I remember being excited when we would occasionally get fresh bread, and baked beans and sausages, bangers and mash were an absolute luxury that we craved when I was in school. Discipline was very strict. If you misbehaved, you would be caned. And I actually never got caned, but many kids were. And it could be for minor infractions, like not being dressed properly, or being caught running around outside of your dorm room after the lights were out at nighttime. Where we slept were in these barrack-style rooms with 12 or 15 metal beds. They all had sagging mattresses. We had bowls at the end of each room, and somebody would come in with a pot of hot water in the morning and fill the bowls. And that's, instead of taking a shower in the morning, you would just wash your face with the hot water and then go downstairs for breakfast. We learned a lot of Latin, and we were a lot of the sort of the classical. We had got a classical education, and so, only some of which had any practical value. But but the teaching quality was quite good. I went to after 3 years of my first school, which the English would refer to as a prep school, but in America it would be before prep school. I went to high school, which was also a boarding school. It's called Rugby School, founded in 1569. 1567, and by Queen Elizabeth I. And all I can say is not much has changed since. It was, again, quite strict. We all had to go to chapel every day. And whether you were Jewish, Muslim, or anything else, everybody went to chapel. Everybody played sports. When you weren't in the classroom, you were on the playing fields. And unless you were in a wheelchair, you were going to play some kind of sports every day, basically. We had classes 6 days a week, and Sundays we got off. And we were not allowed off campus. But I made some good friendships there. I mean, I think when you're in those kinds of conditions, there's a lot of bonding that goes on, and I've got some lifelong friends that have come out of that experience. And I got a good education, and these schools put out successful students, many of whom went to Oxford and Cambridge, and people like me who went to American universities were very much the exception, and not the rule there. But I think today a lot of these schools have become a lot more modern. The bedrooms are real bedrooms now, comfortable. My school finally went co-ed in the late 1970s, early 1980s. They started off with 1 or 2 girls and 800 boys, and now it's more of an equal balance. But then they've got some very fine traditions. But certainly back in my day, these were very challenging, competitive, somewhat austere, tough places to grow up. And I was happy, but there were certainly those who felt like it was a really tough place to go to school.